Hey, my name is Cruz Anderson, and I'm with the Academy of Realist Art. And today I'm going to be showing you how to tone paper using acrylic and ink. It's a pretty simple process, and it can be done at home very easily with just a few materials. At the Academy, we like to use tone paper for figure and portrait drawings. It helps add atmosphere to the pictures and make them look a little more unique. Some of the benefits of using tone paper are having control over the value, color, and texture of the surfaces you're going to be working on. In the video I'll be using Arch's 300-pound hot pressed, but any paper 140-pound or more will work. I hope you enjoyed the video. Today we're going to be hand toning paper with a water-soluble ink from home. You can do it with very little materials, and it's a pretty quick and easy process. So some of the materials you're going to want are your ink of choice. I'm using walnut drawing ink, soft-haired brush I'm using a varnishing brush, a palette knife for mixing the ink and water solution together, or you can use a spoon or your finger, a separate container with water in it, and a mixing plate or pie plate tray. They all work. On top of that, you're going to want your good paper. I'm using Arch's 300-pound hot pressed. It's a very durable paper, and you're going to want something a little heavier because we're going to be applying a lot of water to it. On top of that, you'll want a little scrap piece of paper to run some tests on, and you do want to thoroughly tape it on to about a 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch piece of masonite board. The thicker the better, as the water might make it warp if it's a little thin. Now I'll make the ink solution and run a few tests. It's a pretty simple process, but it's good just to be a little safe so you know what you're going to get before you commit to the good paper. You can save the solution, if you like the intensity, in a separate little container and reuse it in the future, because we won't be using that much of this solution. So before we go to the good paper, I'm just going to run a test on the scrap paper. The way that we're going to be toning the scrap paper is exactly the same as the good paper. First, we're going to want to saturate the paper with water. And then we're going to lay our ink and water solution on top. This helps it coat evenly and leaves less hairy brush strokes. So now I'm going to go to the good paper. As you can see from our tester, it's not very dark, our first layer, and that's kind of to prevent streaking and everything, and it's better just to do a couple more layers rather than to go too dark at first. It makes the process a little easier. So first I'm going to start from one end and go horizontally across, coating it thoroughly with water, and then I'll move to the ink. So I mentioned this was Arch's 300-pound paper. It's pretty durable, so you can put a lot of water on it, but it's best not to put like pools of water on it and to even it out, but it is a very durable paper. It helps if you have, if you're kind of at an angle to your light source so you can see the reflection of the wet paper, and then you can kind of know where it hasn't been saturated enough with water. So now I see that this is coated completely with water, and I'll move to our ink solution. You can see that it's just slightly tinting it, but it is going on smoothly. You can kind of see now that if I had a stiffer brush, it wouldn't be applying the ink as nicely to the paper. It'd be more kind of scratchy. I think that this is a nice value to draw with graphite, since the graphite will be a little lighter, but if you want to draw with white chalk, you can add more layers, just keeping your same consistency, and it will gradually darken the paper. And if you are going to move onto more layers, it's best to vary the direction of the brush stroke, just so you don't get kind of pools of kind of lines from the brush. And that's about it. You just have to let it dry for about 20 to 30 minutes before your next layer, or leave it overnight if you want to draw on it. Okay, so now we're going to be toning the paper with acrylic. It's slightly different than ink, where ink you kind of buy a color and you don't really mix it very often. With acrylics, we're just going to be mixing our own colors right away and then diluting them in water. The materials you're going to want are the same brush, palette knife, mixing tray, vessel for water. But now you're going to want your range of acrylics. I'm going to be using earth tones and then an ultramarine blue because I want a dull green. But whatever you want to tone it to will depend on what colors you use. And just a mixing palette, I'm using a paper one where you can use glass. Okay, so now that I've got my colors laid out, I'm going to go ahead and mix my color that I want to tone the paper with. When you're doing this, it's best not to rush it and just take your time. I'm going to start with white, just to kind of give some opacity to the mixture. Like I said, I'm going to go for a dull green. Okay, now that I have my color mixed, I'm going to make our pigment and water solution. First, I'm going to put the acrylic down and add just a little bit of water to it to initially break it up. You don't want to add all your water in right away because it'll the acrylic will just kind of sit underneath the water and it won't mix very thoroughly or easily. This is going to take a little bit of time. We want to make sure that all of the little pieces of paint kind of break up. I like to kind of just rub my finger in it sometimes. As the water gets more saturated, it'll break up a little slower, so you can add it piece by piece as you go. If you look, you can see how the paint breaks apart along the edges. So you want to be mindful of that and sometimes lean the water to one side to kind of help break it up. This whole process might take you about 5 to 10 minutes. But it's best to be thorough because if you have these little specks when you're toning the paper, they'll be really saturated and they'll kind of ruin the look in the end. So now I'm just breaking up the last little pieces with my finger. It's a little easier than the palette knife. So if I just tilt it, we can see how those little specks are, there's very few now. It's kind of cool how the acrylic breaks up in the water too. I think that that's looking pretty good. It's pretty ready to tone now. So now we're going to run our tester. This is just the opposite side of the sheet I used in the ink video. Same technique, we're going to lay the water on and then lay our acrylic mixture on top of it. And like with the ink, we don't want it too saturated with pigment because we will do a few layers instead of going for that initial dark right away. And I think that that looks pretty good. So now we're ready to tone the good paper. I'm using Arches 300 pound, just like in the ink video. But you can use anything over about 140 pound paper. If it's anything under that, it'll start to buckle like our tester. And I'm going to start the exact same by laying on the water first, making sure that I've coated it evenly by kind of shining a light on it or angling your board in the direction of a light. that looks pretty good. I'm going to lay the acrylic and water solution now. As you put it down, you can kind of go forward and backward to pull the pigment around to make sure you can get it as even as possible. If your paper starts to raise a bit on the edges because of the water that you're putting on it, don't worry. As it dries, it'll kind of flatten out as long as it's taped down properly. And now that it's starting to set, I'm going to stop brushing it, because once it kind of starts to settle in and bond to the paper, you'll start to get streaks, and so it's good to just stop at a certain point. But I think that that looks pretty good for the first layer. This one I'm going to do 2 on, but if you reach the color that you want, the value that you want from the first go, that's all you need to do. So here are some of the results of the 2 methods that we've just went over. These 2 pages are toned with the acrylic and water solution, and these 2 with ink. This page right here has about 3 layers, while this one having 1. You can see how it gets darker while still maintaining that kind of even finish. This is a pretty simple method that you can do from home, and it's pretty straightforward. So I hope that you've enjoyed the video and you found it useful. Thank you.